Hello, everyone. I am very excited to be here today alongside some amazing speakers. Let me introduce you to Varun Parmar, who's General Manager of Adobe's Gen Studio and Firefly for Enterprise, to Christopher Hirsch, who is Senior Director and Head of Brand and Creative and Social at Intel, and our very own Abby Clausen, President and CEO of Dentsu Creative. My name is Jason Oak. I'm Global Client President here at Dentsu, working with Adobe. We are here today to talk about AI, which you may have heard some talk about this week. But today we're calling it scaling without sacrifice, because a lot of the conversations around AI seem to be about the trade-offs. What's the role of humanity versus the role of technology? Or do we have to give up creative quality if we're creating more and more assets? And how do we ensure that there are guardrails? So we want to talk about that and actually get into what does it look like to scale. We were just talking a little bit ahead of time about how last year there was a lot of big talk and promises, but this year people actually have experience doing this, and we can actually talk about what's it like in the real world actually trying to get this done, and where are we on that journey. But we're all dealing with more volume, more personalization, more speed, and I think we'd love to see it as a world potentially without sacrifice and without trade-offs, where you can get more quality and more speed and more volume and more personalization without having to trade anything off. So really excited to have Adobe here in particular, because Adobe's Gen Studio and Firefly are really helping to lead a lot of those shifts, and I think are some of the best tools out there for activating creativity in what we're calling the content supply chain. And at Dentsu, we're working quite close with Adobe and with Intel on this journey. So just to kick us off, I'd like to ask each one of you to say in a sentence or two, like, when we talk about scaling without sacrifice, what does that mean to you? I'll start with you, Varun.
Yeah, great to be on the panel, and thank you for the partnership. So I think, like, for me, it's all about like not sacrificing the brand, and making sure like the performance of the content that's being produced is actually at par or better than what was being done before. So I think that those are the two key things.
Absolutely. How about you, Christopher?
So when I think about it, like at the end of the day, our role with this creative and this content is to still drive the business, right? Like the hardcore metrics at the end of the day are, we have to contribute to revenue. And our business is more and more on the B2B side, and that's how I get judged. And so when I think about, the idea of even the word sacrifice, right? It often for us means to give something up, but it used to mean, to make something sacred. I think there's a tension there for us. And how do we continue to get more, and what defines more? For a lot of us, I think I've been in a number of talks where we've been talking about efficiency, which is important, right? That's, more personalized content, just more content, more engaging content. But I think more and more we're going to have to start to get to effectiveness, which is just content that at the end of the day is more powerful to drive that revenue.
Yeah, content that performs. Yeah. Abby, how's Dentsu thinking about this?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, we talk about how we need to really evolve the conversation around generative AI and take it from a place of, it is all about speed, it's all about cost, lowering costs, reducing costs. It should not be, to your point, a sacrifice. It should be additive, and it should actually help us do more and do better work and be more effective if we do it right.
I love that. So, Varun, maybe let's start with the big picture. When we talk about the content supply chain, what does that even mean? And how is Adobe helping to modernize the way that companies create content?
Yeah, so when we talk about the content supply chain, it's like looking at all the way from starting with the planning and the workflow aspect of it, then going into the creative and the production aspect of it. Obviously, at the center of all of it is, what's your digital asset management solution? It then goes over to the activation, and once it's activated, like, what are the insights that you're feeding in so that it becomes a virtuous cycle? So thinking about all of these 5 different steps as one unified sort of view at what the workflow looks like, and optimizing that for speed, agility, velocity, outcome, optimizations, right? So that's what content supply chain is. And I think from an Adobe perspective, we've been doing it for over a decade now, obviously creativity for the last 40 years. And what we have is now an optimized solution that we call Adobe Gen Studio, that we have fused in AI through the specific steps of the process where you can actually start to see dramatic outcomes. And what's unique about this is that I think Adobe is the only company that can actually bring creativity and marketing together, right? And we were just talking around like some of the results that we're seeing around AI, so we can get into that. But essentially thinking of this as an end-to-end process, making sure that all of the different stakeholders, folks who are in your creativity team, your marketing team, your analytics team, all of them, getting them on a single platform so there's an end-to-end view that everybody has so that you can bring down the silos is when those dramatic outcomes start to get delivered.
Amazing. So speaking of dramatic outcomes, Christopher, Intel was really, I think, one of the early adopters of a lot of these tools, and working closely with you as an agency, we've seen you on this journey. And so, can you talk a little bit about what you've seen, what you've learned, and how Intel is progressing along this journey, and especially coming back to the theme about kind of creativity and sacrifice, like how are you balancing speed versus quality versus authenticity versus brand safety and all the things we have to sort of keep in mind as marketers?
Yeah, it's a lot all at once, but we have a really great relationship with Dentsu. You guys help us both, with some of our campaign creative, but also with our partners at Tag. We've built an internal creative and production studio, what we call Spark Studios, and that's allowed us to really, over the last year in particular, start to trial a lot of these new tools. We're a customer of Adobe, but the first thing I start with is I don't just run a creative team, I run a brand team, and what is that brand, and kind of what do we start with, and how do we keep that safe with the new tools? It first comes down to the people, right? A brand is just perceptions in people's minds, and you got to make sure your team members across the entire creative and content flow are up to speed on your brand. And we just refreshed our brand earlier this year, which means new guidelines, doing those trainings, making sure the operator of the tool knows the brand intimately. Then the second thing is the tools need to learn your brand. You have to be able to take your brand guidelines and put it into the tool. And one of the things we found with the LLMs is the guidelines you have for the people aren't always the same that you should have for your tools. We found that the tools became better as we made the guidelines bigger, longer form, more content, more examples. That's something I'd encourage everyone. Really think through both your activations and your platforms. So we have a lot of like social media examples, out of home, digital, it could be retail, and show people like this is on brand and this isn't, and start to tag the why behind it. All of a sudden the model started to generate more on brand content. Last thing I'll say here too is there are challenges and there are opportunities in front of us. Like one of the big challenges we're recognizing is we democratize the tools. Everyone can start producing content, and not everyone who's necessarily producing content is going to be trained up on the brand, and that's the thing to be mindful of. For me, it's nice. My creatives sit on the brand team. They tend to kind of know and work within the system. But the other side of it is we've been seeing is there is an opportunity to have more space for what the brand is. Like I think we've been so focused on a brand as one thing that anything that starts to stray away, we feel, hey, that's off brand, and maybe we shouldn't be doing that. But as we've played with a lot of the tools that become more visual, more immersive, more surreal, I think it's starting to challenge us to ask, is that okay to stretch the boundaries of the brand? Is part of personalizing the brand almost kind of the way the algorithms work? Let that be the connection to someone, and if that's their way of resonating with your brand, maybe that's an okay thing. But those are kind of the forefront questions that we're dealing with now.
I find that tension really interesting, that in some ways you have to have even tighter brand standards in an era where an algorithm is sometimes designing your assets for you, but at the same time you have to have the flexibility to say, like, how can this push the envelope a little bit and maybe feel a little bit authentic or relevant in that moment, and it doesn't feel like it's coming out of a template. And that's a really interesting tension that I think a lot of brands need to start struggling with. Abby, I wanted to ask you from an agency perspective. Agencies are ultimately in the business of people. That's the main thing that we sell and that we offer. So what role does the human creator play in all of this, in kind of maintaining brand consistency or in guiding the algorithms and guiding the tools, especially when we think of across multiple campaigns, multiple brands, multiple regions that we often have to juggle. How is DC thinking about the balance of humanity and technology?
So I'll answer it in sort of two parts. And the first is a little bit more focused on what I would call kind of tactically making sure that the human is there as a little bit of a guardrail as the technology evolves. And, Christopher, I think you kind of referenced this. It is about where do you involve the human upfront in the process to set up what is the right brand guidance, the tone, how are we feeding the models. That has to be done by humans, by setting that tone and that standard and setting the governance around it. I think a little bit about who's grading the homework, right? At what points do we have people coming in and just making sure, this is right. This is maybe a little off-brand, and especially when you're running a global brand, because there are some cultural nuances depending on which market you're in. So I think there's absolutely a role for humans to make sure that we're living up to kind of the standards that we set for our clients and they set for their brands. But on a more inspirational front, I guess I would say, I think there's been this kind of fear that's permeated the industry, or maybe it's not even fear, but just uncertainty, and people sometimes do poorly with uncertainty around just how is this going to change the work that we do, and what is it going to replace, and what is it not going to replace. And so we've talked a lot about this notion of augmenting. How can Gen AI and technology augment our creatives, and what won't it be able to replace? And I think that's really this word ingenuity. There is a human element to this idea of ingenuity, and I think if we, really lean into this notion of kind of augmented ingenuity, that's a pretty cool concept for anyone who loves creativity and loves to, be creative.
If I can add, some tangible examples, I think just building on what Christopher was saying. So we have this application called Gen Studio for performance marketing. And one of the key value propositions in the application is that it actually builds a brand ontology model. So you throw all of your brand guidelines, and it's not just text-based, so like tone of voice, editorial guidelines, but it also has your channel-specific guidelines, and it also has your image and video guidelines. And what we found was that, using the state-of-the-art technology, you need to essentially have guardrails in place, to Abby, to your point. So in the application, what we do is we go ahead and first train your brand ontology, and then everything that gets produced from a text perspective or image or video is based on the brand guidelines. But one of the insights is that we actually have an adversarial network where there are two AI models. And the second AI model is trained to say, don't trust anything that the AI model generated. Your job is to take the brand guidelines that are codified in the platform, and let's say there are 50 different guidelines. On each of them, on a score of 1 to 100, you have to grade how this first model created something, and then explain yourself why do you give a specific score. So I think what's been fascinating is that when we've actually rolled it out to customers, I think we've got Microsoft, Lenovo, Intuit, University of Phoenix, Lumen Technologies, we've got really, really great brands. And this has been fascinating is when they actually look at the score, and then they look at the explainability of why a specific score was given, and using that to basically inform where the model is actually really good versus where it needs further tuning, to your point. And usually what we find is that the brand team is the custodian, of this model, right? So they are the ones that control it. They are the ones who are updating it. And actually one example, in the case of Lenovo, what they found was that oftentimes the PDF never got to the regions. They were still working on version 3 when the corporate had moved to version 11. So what they decided to do was that the brand ontology that was actually codified in the product was the source of truth for everyone in the world. And to your point, we actually built this ontology model to actually train AI models. But the request we got from Lenovo was, no, we want humans to read it. So we actually augmented the product to actually give a plain description of what the model is codified with. So then you have one place where the model can understand things, but also the humans can read it, and that becomes the source of truth for the entire organization. So this is real world example of what's happening out there.
That's amazing. That's such a great story. I like the devil's advocate AI agent as a role. I think every organization could use one of those. So we've talked a lot about sort of the how teams are evolving and how roles are evolving. Like I love each of your thoughts on sort of how do you see creative teams and creative organizations evolving? Are there certain roles that are going to be replaced by automations? Are there certain roles that become more important? Are there new roles that we need to create, or new ways of working amongst teams? Like how do you see organizations and roles evolving? I'll put that to all three of you.
I'll take a crack at that. Look, it's neither of the extremes that I think we've heard, right? It's not that these tools come in and they're going to replace all creatives. I don't believe that. I also don't think it's going to be, hey, we're going to reskill or upskill every last person in the creative sphere and no one's jobs are at any risk. I think what we want to probably be at risk is the mundane, the things that, take up, energy but don't drive the business. And that's where, the conversation, as you started, Jason, last year when we were at Cannes was, hey, we're just starting to experiment. Well, we got about a year's of extra work under all of our belts, and we're starting to find some real wins there. And the first thing was starting with the creatives themselves, and I think they just needed a little time and space to understand, hey, there's an opportunity here. We needed to do training on the tools, and that's where even the partnerships come into play. It's not just licensing of software. It's, hey, somebody sit down with us and co-create with us for a little bit. That was really tremendously helpful. It got us a jump start on it. And then what we're just seeing is creatives are curious people. Let them go and play for a while. The amount of new learnings that come into the system, just so fast, whether it comes from the teams developing new prompt portfolios, libraries of good prompts, and kind of being able to reuse assets to just going outside the bounds and trying a lot of tools to figure out what works, but also starting to find your standards. I think that's really important, is starting to land on fewer but more platform level tools so that you can start to go deeper and have the same people working with some of the same things. It's leading to building of bigger ideas.
Yeah. So maybe just building on what Christopher was saying, so some real world examples. So I think the first thing is we talked about how the brand team is really the custodians of this model that has this brand ontology. And what we're seeing is that clearly the creative technologist role is emerging as the ones that actually own and update and refine and optimize this model, right? So inside of brand teams, we are seeing all the successful deployments for global brands that they're actually saying, we're going to hire a creative technologist or take someone and then put them here, and they are going to own the brand model. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing, and I think the jury's still out there, is that in a model where you are a global brand and you have your corporate office, your headquarters, and you have the regional teams, I think the jury is still out there in terms of what's the right model for that. Do you actually have a hub and spoke model where the hub actually controls, what part of the process is the hub controlling versus you're actually going to allow the fields to do, right? And we've seen in certain cases, where leaders have said, I want to consolidate majority of things out here, and I want to give 10% creative freedom at the edges, right? So all the regions have 10%. Versus, some organizations say, hey, I want 20% of this to be done centrally, and then I want the fields, out there in the regions to be enabled around that. So I think that's the second thing. And then I would say the third thing is that, with this whole first thing that you mentioned, Jason, around optimizing the content supply chain, getting everyone on the same page, we are definitely seeing, let's take the example of Adobe. Adobe Global Marketing Organization, about 2,000 marketers in there, about $1 billion of media spend. We are seeing our creatives become more analytical because they're on the platform, and all of a sudden they're seeing creative insights, and they're actually questioning, should they be creating all of these 100 variants, or they should actually focus on the 5 that's actually performing. At the same time, we're actually seeing media teams actually become more creative. And they're like, hey, if I have this tool at my fingertip where actually, if you're a creative, you can write pixels, right? You can draw pixels, but you can't write. But if you are a marketer, your job is to write, right? You are great with words. And that's exactly what the interface is right now with all of these LLMs. So we're actually seeing a bunch of these performance marketers start to self-serve their needs, which is, there is a cultural moment happening, there is something happening where there's an inflection point on the performance of an ad unit, and they're like, I just want to turn this around. I want to make this small incremental change. And the fact that they have these tools is forcing them to actually, start to make these optimizations. So I think there's some really interesting dynamics happening out there.
I think there's a few things that we're seeing. One is, just what is the relationship between a creative and AI? And we talk a lot about this idea of it being relational. So it isn't just about it's about the interaction that a creative has with the AI. And it's not just creative, by the way. I mean, we have strategists who use, models to basically debate them. As they're developing a strategy, poke holes in my strategy, whatnot. So it's not just creatives in the agency. And so you could start to see a world where, for many, many years, we've had art directors and copywriters together. How does that evolve when you have a partner who's actually, an artificially intelligent partner and can do a lot, I think the other, element that we're excited and seeing a lot more of is that it's making what has, previously been impossible possible. So creative ideas that could just never be executed before. I mean, it's just unleashed this opportunity for producing really amazing things at scale using AI. I think about the work that we're doing with Adobe around MLB, for example. So there's a lot of really interesting capabilities that it's, again, coming back to that word, augmenting our ideas and what we're able to do.
I do want to just acknowledge, I totally agree. Like, one of the things that we're really interested with our creatives is they themselves are becoming more strategic and taking on that kind of strategist lens themselves, because they can start to see in much faster time what creative is effective. And then the other part of this for us has been, to your point, is how do you use these tools across the teams? One that we've just started implementing, it's actually using a Dentsu tool called Dice. The creative is only ever as good as the brief, right? We all know this. Well, we're using this Dice tool to basically help with that briefing process with the campaign strategists. They can sit down with us live, and basically we'll use the tool to help write the brief. All of a sudden, we're getting much better inputs, much faster, fewer rounds of creative, and that's part of it too. You just have to define your success criteria. But I would also encourage everyone, think who else in your large organization you can go talk to. A key partner for us over the last year, who had been a huge blocker for us in 23 and 24, was the legal teams. Go talk to legal. Make sure that they understand why we're trying to do these things, because as lawyers can be, they're very conservative. They do not always want to open up this, perceived risk. And the more that we've involved them to better understand the tools as well as kind of the creative intentions, all of a sudden we're having better relationships with the technologists themselves, whether outside the company or inside. If you're a tech company, we created our own LLM, but also with your agency partners. Open dialogue has just led to new features being implemented much faster.
I'm just going to give a plug to Firefly while we're talking about the legal considerations, because we were, I think, the first creative agency to deploy Firefly to our creatives at scale. And part of why we were able to do that is because we got very comfortable with the legal, considerations around Firefly, because it's all trained on Adobe licensed imagery. So, it is about having the right partners, the right tools that get everybody comfortable.
Yeah. So, Christopher, I'd love to kind of pick up on where you were just going, which is that cross-functional collaboration is now so important, and media, technology, creative, strategy, legal, and increasingly those lines blurring, where you're having creatives being more strategic and technologists being more legal. I don't know. So how is technology actually changing how people are interacting across a cross-functional team?
Yeah, like I said, there's just interesting use cases, whether it's at the first stage and thinking about your briefing process, all the way to the end when it comes down to the measurement. I think there's kind of two takeaways that we've had. One is, don't just start playing with tools without taking the moment to step back and ask, like, what are you trying to solve for? Like, have a framework, right? And the first thing that we did, in kind of late 2023 and early last year was we just did an assessment. We asked, the foundational questions, like, what are our problems? What are we trying to solve for? What, are those business outcomes that we're trying to drive? And, what elements of our organization are ready and what needs to get upskilled? And just having that assessment first really helped as we got into implementation. And then the thing not to forget, because you got to go back to your leadership to prove that this investment in new tools and time is worthwhile, is the measurement side of it. And that's where, define the, KPIs for the tools themselves. And it could be tactical things as, Small is like, what's the time to create an asset? It can be bigger to how long does it take me to actually get a campaign out the door? Well, there's a lot of savings there, and you can go and intercept moments. Maybe you get to back to school, in time and have some pre-work. All the way to, at the end, it's what actions did your, potential customer take to actually engage with the content. And I think it's important that we don't just turn to what are going to be perceived by your leadership, whether that's your CFO or your CMO boss as a vanity metric. Really think through, like, what are the outcomes you're trying to drive? And the tools are starting to come along with that. They're starting to be built in, what you guys are doing, with your generative platform, that performance is king. And so I think that's a really big, important part of what we've been trying to stitch from that first brief all the way to, is this effective?
A lot of this touches on, it's as much about change management in an organization as it is about just deploying technology and how do you get people comfortable with changing ways of working, changing roles, et cetera. I mean, Varun, like from an operational standpoint, what changes do you see starting to happen inside marketing organizations as they're using these tools, and how do companies need to think about that deployment?
Yeah, and just like to build on the previous point for a second, I think like one like really fascinating change we've seen, this is a real example from Adobe itself. The fact that the creative team can actually see what's getting activated and see what's live has fundamentally changed the discussion that's happening. It's like, well, you asked me for 200 assets, but at the end of the day, only 20 of them got activated. But you're asking me for another 400 more? And the fact that on the platform they can see in real time across all of the channels. Like, wait a second. So I think like that's just one real example of like driving accountability. And I think like, I mean, I'm a product person for past 25 years. I've been building software products, and I think like when people went to like a centralized way of building, and like there are tools like Jira and Confluence that came in that brought product engineering and design together, it fundamentally transformed how software development was done. I think some of the same sort of benefits and learnings that we see from that software development paradigm are now coming to like the content development and like sort of performance marketing and stuff. So then sort of to go back to your point around change management and and what things that we are seeing change like operationally. So I think I think if I would like take a step back and be very objective around sort of what's preventing us from realizing like 10x or 100x value in terms of what Gen AI can do, is around this change management question, right? And we touched upon this like earlier on. Where should we start? Like, I mean, like this is so basic, but like, I have X number of channels, X number of geographies, X number of formats, and so on and so forth. I have this amazing technology, Gen AI, whatever application you're using, homegrown from an agency partner or from a tech vendor. Where should I start? What's that use case? And what we found is that the best place to start is where you have a underserved need or an unmet need. And the reason for that is that whenever there is change, stakeholders react in different ways, and there's like, apprehension and fear around what's going to happen around my job and my training and so on and so forth. And you spend so much calories and effort in like, calming down the waters. But if you can only start and saying, do you believe that we are able to meet our content needs or personalization needs, around what all of our channels and forwards and geographies need? The answer is no. Like, I'm yet to find one brand that says yes. Okay, let's just start the place where we are not able to meet that persona need. And that's like a great place for everyone to actually say, no antibodies. Let's start to see, it's a low risk area. Let's try to see where the results are. And once you see those results, you learn what's working or not, like your culture, the ways of working and stuff. And then you start to scale all of those things. So that's like one real example of where we've seen stuff.
Hey, Abby, we have a unique relationship with Adobe, obviously, where we're a customer of Adobe. They're a client of ours, and we, use their tools on a lot of our shared clients as well. Like, what are the sort of benefits or advantages that you see in this sort of unique relationship that we have, and how closely we're working together with them and sort of charting this new world?
Well, I think Christopher and Varun have talked a little bit about how cross-functionally within a marketing organization and all the different stakeholders have to work together differently using these tools. I also think agencies internally are also working differently, but they're working differently with clients. We have done some really interesting work with Adobe around this notion of how can we be customer zero together of the Gen Studio suite of technology. So, for example, we have fused, I think this is the first time an agency's done this, our Workfront instance with your Workfront instance as a client. And that allows us to create so much transparency around the briefings happening in Workfront, the feedback's happening in Workfront. We can track the process in Workfront. I think what we're seeing through our relationship with Adobe is probably kind of like the canary in the coal mine for how agency client workflows and relationships are going to evolve using this technology. And it's led to a lot more transparency, a lot more fluidity. I think we're getting to great work. You want to speed up cycle time, all of those things. By being able to kind of be on the leading edge of that. And also, by the way, as we use the product, say, hey, Varun, it would be really great if Firefly did, being able to feed back into the product team and as real use cases of how not just a marketing enterprise is using the tools and technology internally, but how an agency and that marketing enterprise are connecting as part of the ecosystem has been incredibly valuable.
So we're at time, but just to close, I wanted to ask each of you, when we started, we talked about how far we've come in the last year, from last year talking a lot about the promise to this year it being a lot more practical. If we flash forward to Cannes next year or the year after that, how is this space going to evolve in the next few years, and what do you think we can expect to see as this all evolves and as we all learn on this journey?
I'll make two quick comments, one on the tools, one on the people. On the tool front, look, it's been a Cambrian-like explosion of number of apps and widgets that you have available. At some point soon, I think that starts to consolidate, especially for enterprise buyers, knowing our procurement cycles, the licensing requirements. I think what you're going to see is we're going to end up with more platform-like options in the market that really start to win out. And the things that are applications today just become features within larger platforms. On the people front, look, I'm even listening to Varun and Abby, the takeaway here is there's more opportunity for creatives, right? You're becoming our brief writers, you're becoming the analytics team, you're taking more agency as you deploy these tools. Shoot, you're even the lawyers now in the room, it sounds like. So a lot that can be done. As marketing leaders, we do need to continue to support that. It's not making it feel like a fight and not making it feel as existential, and just really leaning into, hey, there's a lot of opportunity, but it's on us to role model it, be in front of your teams, bring in people to do the trainings. I think that was our big unlock, was making it easier for people to lean in with us. Yeah. Started to get the tools being used.
I like the format of your answer, so I'm going to steal it. I think, from a kind of tools and technology standpoint, we've spent the better part of a decade optimizing the media supply chain, right? And now we're in the process of optimizing the content supply chain or creative supply chain. I think, where those two things come together is going to get really interesting. How are we connecting that content supply chain with the media supply chain? And that's something we are highly focused on. We've connected Gen Studio, Dentsu Plus, which is our sort of build on Gen Studio, to Dentsu Connect, which is our media tools platform. Being able to do that for clients is going to be a huge unlock, I think, in terms of reducing waste, increasing efficiency, and ultimately getting to the holy grail of being able to, understand and drive our work based entirely on outcomes, which would be amazing. From a people standpoint, I think one of the hallmarks of success for people these days is really going to be about how comfortable can you get living in change. And I will say, I think agencies a lot of times get a bad rap for a lot of things, but man, we are comfortable living in change and through change. And so I think that's a huge asset as we go through this transformation, and something I'm really excited about.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is maybe at Cannes next year, I think you will see examples of breakout success. Hard metrics, hard results, hard ROI, where you will start to see this transformation deliver real business outcomes. And I think a lot of us out here on the panel next year will talk about specific examples where it's meaningful. So, yeah.
Well, listen, thank you so much for your time, your generosity with your opinions and your thoughts. I hope you guys are walking away with a sense of excitement and possibility and opportunity. I think this is the most exciting time to be in this business, and we have so much ahead of us. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you all for your attention. Take care.